Good morning and welcome everybody. My name's Cam Hawker. I'm Principal at Zephyr West Government Engagement and Strategic Consulting. And I'm delighted to host this session, Adapting or Evolving During COVID-19. Today's session is hosted by the opposite, and it is the brainchild, I guess, of Dr. Nicholas Duck, who I'll be speaking to in a moment. Today we're going to try and move past conversations on social distancing, remote working, second wave fears, and try and get some fresh perspectives and deep insights into what COVID-19 means, both for the future of short-term and long-term working moving forward. And we have an absolute cavalcade of stars, of experts for you today. Firstly, we have Dr. Nicholas Duck of the Innovative Management Consultancy, The Opposite. He's going to be talking to us on simplification. We have Professor Simon Moss of Charles Darwin University, who will offer his insights on leadership. We have Dr. Gemma Reid of the University of the Sunshine Coast, who will talk to us on complex systems. NASIR from CDEX Labs, who can offer his perspectives on experience design. Mark Andrew of Scenario, who has expertise on work design. Marvin Oka, who's an expert in behavioural modelling research, and is going to talk to us on second order change. And SAWSAN Howard, who is Head of Brands and Corporate Affairs at Australian Super, who will speak to us on megatrends. Before we move on, I just want to cover a few brief housekeeping matters. We're on Zoom webinar this morning, which is probably a platform that many of you are used to, possibly even exhausted on Zoom at the moment, which is something that we'll get to during today's session. We're going to run a fairly open structure. So the first half of the session will essentially be me speaking to the panelists, having conversation with them, and also the panelists conversing with each other, asking each other questions, challenging their points of view. We'll then move into Q&A component of the session, where you will have the opportunity to jump in and ask questions either of individual panelists or the group as a whole. And you have two ways you can interact there. So you may choose to, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A feature. You can go in there and type in a question, which later in the session I will identify, read on screen. And remember, if you want to direct that at one particular person, please specify that. Otherwise, we'll throw it out there to the whole group. You also have the ability in that function to upvote questions that you like. So if you happen to see a question, maybe someone's stolen your thunder, you think that's a great question, please get in there and upvote it. That'll essentially move it to the top of the queue. You also have the option to come up on screen if you like, and we really encourage you to do that. If you do so, please make sure you have headphones so you can avoid audio feedback. Make sure that your camera is at a good angle so that we can see you. And it's also useful if you can tell us who you are, identify yourself, and give us your affiliation today when you come up and ask the question, which will be done a little bit later on. There's also a chat box feature in Zoom webinar, so you have the ability to converse with each other while our conversation is going on, put your perspectives in there, and we really value that as well. Okay, I'm about to bring in Dr. Nicholas Duck, who is an organisational psychologist and the founder of The Opposite. Nick, I think we have a nice clip to start with in our discussion, don't we?
Yes, we do. I think Ash will pop something up in a sec.
Yeah. Here we go.
You may recognise this person.
I do.
Shopping centres remain open. I was referring to the food courts in the shopping centres. Shopping centres, retail premises in shopping centres, they will remain open unless they're the ones that I've mentioned about beauty, therapy, tanning, waxing, etc. Those premises, because they're personal services premises, they will obviously not be able to remain open. So I want to be very clear, the shopping centres remain open. In each of the retail premises, there will need to be displayed to assist patrons how many people can be inside that enclosed area in that shop at any one time. That's just observing the 4 square metre rule. I would hope many retail premises were already doing that. I'll be very clear, shopping centres remain open. There's no need to rush out to shopping centres or the food stores or any of these. They will continue to remain open, and you should go and get things as you need them. Thank you, Phil.
Prime Minister.
Okay, I think we all remember that. It seems like a long time ago, and we remember the confusion that came out of that, I suppose. So why is it so difficult to relate information in those circumstances, do you think, Nick? How do we take something, a complex concept and simplify it for public consumption?
Yeah, look, I had a lot of sympathy for all the leaders during this time, because it's really hard to actually develop policy to begin with, but to do policy on the run during a crisis is extraordinarily complex. And the funny thing is, it kind of reflects a little bit at what we see all the time in workplaces, which is whenever we want to sort of modify and change behaviour, people have this sort of unusual thought process, which is the best way we're going to modify behaviour is almost to start making lists of things we don't want to see anymore, and then make a list of perhaps things we do want to see. And I think that's the biggest challenge there. What you saw with the Prime Minister there is that we sort of start to deep dive straight into that layer of detail, basically swimming around in the weeds. And whenever you have like a list, the list is basically never ending because you can always add more and more to it. And which is what ended up happening. We ended up saying, these are all the things you can't do. And then over time, that list seemed to get larger and larger as well. So I think the reason why that tends to happen is a lot of, say, organisations and government, they kind of miss that first step sometimes, which is kind of like there's kind of two universal rules that could actually have been communicated first. So instead of going, look, here's a list of 50 things you can't do, which is impossible to remember, it seemed to me there was like two general principles that during COVID-19 that they missed, or at least they thought everyone assumed was obvious. And the first thing was, the rule was basically remove yourself from harm as far as practical. That was kind of rule number one. And rule number two appeared to be, if you believe you're infected or you are infected, then remove yourself from other people so that you don't infect them, basically. Mm-hmm. And quite often these communications would come out and they kind of just jump straight into all of this sort of detail, and they didn't take you back to those first level principles. Mm-hmm. And the beauty of having a first level principle or a higher order rule is that it then helps to clarify where there's confusion. So when they started to go, what's an essential service? Well, then you can start to go back to that rule and you go, well, actually, it's quite clear what an essential service is. An essential service is basically something that if you were to remove it, it would actually create more harm than the COVID-19 virus itself. And it takes you back to that first rule. But instead, I think what this sort of deep diving into lists is the thing that actually confuses people. And certainly, it's almost impossible to communicate that level of complexity at that level of detail to give people a sense of comfort.
I wonder if, even in a sense, it reflects like whether government needs to trust people a little bit more, because you're talking about fairly broad principles, but there they felt the need to go into like really, really fine detail, and inevitably it got fairly confusing. But if they are willing to sort of trust people a bit with those principles, perhaps perhaps you can avoid some of that complexity. I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of like a catch-22, because once you go down the path of starting to specify things you can't do, it becomes a lot harder then to give people personal responsibility.
Yeah.
Because you've actually created a whole series of rules for them to navigate already. And in many ways, it gives people peace of mind. So instead of having to actually own the risk themselves, they can just look at that list and go, well, I'm doing all the things that the list tells me to, so I'm safe now. And one of the things that came out recently was, I think, when they said we could now visit our families, the Premier said something along the lines of, yes, you can do this now, but I'm not going to do it because I don't think it's safe. And I think sending those sorts of messages is really confusing to people, because it's basically saying, yeah, it's okay, but it's also socially improper to do so as well. And I think in general, the message really should be something like, look, if we go back to those principles again, you say, look, ultimately you want to harm minimization. So keep following that principle and use your judgment. And I think then people can make that determination themselves.
Yeah, I had a situation in Canberra where I'm usually based. I like going hiking, and hiking was officially allowed, but at one point there was a guideline to only do 30 minutes of outside exercise a day. So I like going hiking for like half a day, maybe a full day, and I couldn't reconcile those two things. And I actually tried to do some reading on it and work out what was legal, what the difference between a legally enforceable rule or law was and a guideline. I kept hiking.
Yeah, well, there was also over in the UK, the police actually in one sort of district, they actually got drones to fly around trying to catch people out exercising and doing hiking in the mountains. So they had these little drones zipping around, basically trying to detect non-compliance. I think, basically, when you get to the level of, just trying to enforce the rules rather than actually trying to enforce what's sensible, what's actually going to hurt people, then if we're kind of going down a kind of a slippery slope to nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and there's a very real danger of backlash there, obviously. And yeah, as you say. Okay, before I'm going to move on and talk to Simon shortly, but I wanted to throw it open to the panel a little bit there and ask if anyone wanted to jump in with either question from Nick, perspective on anything we've just discussed.
Well, watching that video, Nick, I sort of hoped we could go back in time and you could start opposite earlier, perhaps round about the John Hewson time, and you could have sorted out that whole GST on cake debacle.
I remember that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny you say that, Mark, because we were thinking about, I was thinking about using that video as well, because it felt like exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's going back a ways, but yeah, I remember it well. Anyone else on that, or not on birthday cake necessarily, but on the need to simplify complex messages? And we can come back to it, of course.
Yeah, I think interesting is that ultimately people underestimate how complicated it is to communicate. And when you think about it, it's because communication ultimately is basically a symbol of the complexity that we're trying to manage. And more often than not, it's not only is it the content you're trying to communicate, but there's also the other thing you're communicating is your body language and also all the subtext behind it as well.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at what the message they're sending, people aren't just listening to the rules. They're also trying to gather information on where is this headed? How long is this going to last? Is he looking fearful? If he's looking fearful, that means this could be going on for a long time. So there's all these little subtleties when you watch somebody give a presentation, especially when it affects everyone, where you kind of, you're fishing around for more information. And so it's more complicated than just communicating rules. And I think that's the other thing as well, is that the responsibility to deliver those messages is much higher than just reading off a list. It's the tone and everything else that comes with it.
Yeah, and one thought that occurs to me, and I might pick this up with Simon if he wants to speak to it, is I guess even the pace of communication, how often they're doing it. So in those early stages of the crisis, the Prime Minister was giving many press conferences, and because I'm based in Canberra usually, I know he was working extremely long hours, which is what you'd expect, and that's great. But sometimes you wonder whether there can actually be too much communication and sort of too much detail, and does it actually reassure people to see the leader on screen, literally every day? Might be a nice segue to move over to Simon now. Simon, your background's obviously in leadership and studying leadership. So I think COVID-19 has highlighted some of the contradictions that leaders, need to resolve, such as how to promote conformity to rules but enable autonomy, and how to foster openness and diverse perspectives whilst precluding certain information. There's a lot of information out there, which is sort of something that we've just touched on. Would you like to speak to that to start with?
Yeah, definitely. And also, I wouldn't mind taking your point about the frequency of leadership speeches, because what we really should have had is a situation where the leaders spoke at a very regular time to provide just this sense of predictability, which they didn't do necessarily. And also, leaders should always promote people changing their behaviour on the first day of something, maybe the first day of a week, first day of a month, because people are much more likely and willing to change their behaviour at the beginning of something. It just feels like something's new. And so because that wasn't the case, compliance was actually quite limited. And then you're sort of talking about the contradictions. And there was a lot of issues there that weren't really fulfilled particularly well. So for example, people are much more likely to feel motivated to do something different when they feel that their individual and unique circumstances are considered. Now, of course, leaders had to promote this sense of uniformity, as you indicated. But they also should have highlighted the fact that somehow government are aware and sensitive and compassionate to individual circumstances. They could have done that by, for example, having a hotline or circumstance where people could have expressed their unique circumstances for potential exceptions and so forth. But that wasn't really set up publicly. So there was a lot of possibilities of resolving those contradictions that weren't taken into account.
That's very interesting. Nick, I think we have a video that might highlight that. Do we want to run that now? And then maybe we can move back into the conversation. This will be fun, I think.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. The new headline.
Okay. Wow. I always find myself chuckling when I watch that, but it's quite serious. Like there were reports in the US at the time that some people had actually gone and ingested cleaning products and things like that, which is, terrifying, obviously. But it does raise an interesting point, Simon. Like, to what extent should leaders be able to, shoot the breeze, like brainstorm in public, like, moot things? Like, that's surely a really extreme example, right? But do we expect the leader to go out there and know exactly what he or she is talking about and be set in their course, or is there more room for maneuver than that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's tempting to sometimes encourage leaders to speak spontaneously in that way, so we get a sense of who they are. But the truth is, there's a problem, there's 4 problems actually with that tendency. I mean, the first is that leaders really need to make sure their words are exactly correct. So, for example, there's one study that indicated even just changing certain words in speeches and emails to like strive and master and progress, something that's synonymous with progress, actually increased the efficiency and productivity of an organization by 35% for a week. So words matter, and people are unlikely to identify the right words in those circumstances. The second issue is that when people are trying to think spontaneously in a situation like he was, then actually our decisions tend to be incorrect. People often think that instincts are correct, but generally the decisions that people make on the spot tend to be biased towards their immediate needs, often and contradict our future goals. So they often tend to be quite inappropriate. And third, and most important problem is that we don't really give the license for leaders to change their ideas. So if a leader, for example, suggests, for example, that disinfectant might be helpful, which he didn't really do, or even something like international students should go home, which is something that Scott Morrison said, although he didn't actually quite meet in that context, people don't give them the right to change their mind. They assume that that's their belief and ideal over time. So then when they do express a contradictory belief later, because of new information, people experience this sense of tension and they're less likely to trust leaders in the future. And that diminished trust actually increases stress in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I can vouch for that as someone who used to work in politics. We call it backflipping, right? So if our opposition, whether they be the government or the actual opposition, depending on where we are, if they change their position, we automatically call it backflipping. Like we don't follow the kind of maxim of when the facts change, we change our mind, and there's political opportunism there. And we do it knowing that we're doing it, essentially. Simon, I know you've conducted a lot of research on counterintuitive findings. I wonder if you could speak to that, at least briefly. Hopefully we can come back to it in more depth, and how you might be able to apply those findings to the situation we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah, so there's a lot of findings about the classical errors that leaders commit. So for example, we happen to know that leaders tend to respond too slowly to disasters, which they may have here. And we know that's true because it's even got a name called the planned continuation bias. We know that leaders, for example, spend too much money in trying to shift a negligible risk to no risk. So when the risk is negligible, as it might be in some places now, leaders will often introduce ideas to convert that to no risk, and the cost can be quite extensive. So there's a whole lot of interesting issues. And the problem is that leaders in the past were never accountable to know all the latest information about how to act better. Where I think as a consequence of COVID, that's going to change in the sense that remuneration and pay of leaders might depend much more on the future consequences of their actions, maybe 5, 10 years from now. With big data and so forth, we can evaluate whether or not the actions of leaders not only improve the finances of an organisation, but the well-being of their employees, the extent to which the organisation or values were fulfilled and so forth. And we might have simple ways of adjusting leaders' pay and remuneration, maybe bonuses in the future, that depend on their actions now. And so as a consequence, they might become much more aware and sensitive to the science of leadership, which until now, leaders have tended to ignore to some degree. Not completely, but haven't taken it maybe seriously enough.
Very interesting. I'm about to move over and chat with Gemma on complex systems, but before I do that, would anyone on the panel like to have a chat to Simon about any of the points he's made, or ask a question, make a point of their own?
Simon, SAWSAN here. Why do you think politicians over all these years have not become better at conditioning the electorate that they may well need to change their mind as they get better and more accurate information?
Look, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Like, why isn't that accepted as such? And look, I think it's ultimately there are some mistaken beliefs of leaders. So, for example, leaders often assume that people want to hear what's best for them. So that was actually one of the reasons that Scott Morrison indicated potentially that international students should perhaps leave if they don't have money, because he thought that, in a way, he was talking to the Australian public. What he was unaware of course, is that really what people really want in their leaders is to know they're going to be compassionate and understanding of their unique circumstances, and that as a consequence, they'll feel safer. So in some ways, because of that, leaders often sort of misconstrue the public, and therefore may not be able to address the sort of the public misconceptions well enough.
Interesting. Okay.
I had a, sorry,
yes.
Cam, I had a quick thought I was going to mention just in relation to probably both Nick and Simon's commentaries around their issues. I'm just wondering if we need to be a little bit careful ourselves about sort of hindsight bias and kind of looking back on decisions that are made with the benefit of hindsight and sort of how that plays out. I'm not sure if either of you want to comment on that.
Yeah, definitely. I actually had hindsight bias written down, but didn't think I had enough time to talk about it. There's not only that bias, there's also an outcome bias, which is that we sort of evaluate the leaders by how the outcomes turned out. So, for example, the outcomes were very successful in Australia. So now we've evaluated our leaders very positively. Now that may have been accurate and fair, but it's often quite biased. Often outcomes occur for reasons that have nothing to do with leaders. And as you say, with hindsight bias, we sort of now assume that what the decision should have been. They may not have been at the time, but nevertheless, leaders did have access to a lot of information that we didn't. So maybe we can still judge them harshly despite our hindsight biases.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it's a nice segue to talk to Gemma. Hi, Gemma.
Hey.
We have a clip to start our conversation with. I think that's going to come up in a moment or two. Here we are. It's a personal favourite of mine.
Oh, รถยังต้องจอดให้อ่ะ โอ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ยเฮ้ย
Okay, wow. So for those of you who don't know, and most of you probably have seen that before, that was taken at a tourist town in Thailand, I think in March. And for those of you who spent time in Thailand, as I have, you'll be familiar with the monkeys, highly intelligent, cheeky, precocious sort of creatures. So because the tourists weren't there, the monkeys descended on that town, and hence we have that scene. So no one necessarily expected at the start of the COVID pandemic that there'd be sort of a monkey invasion of a small town in Thailand. Your work utilises methods for measuring complex systems. So is that sort of outcome something that you can predict in your work?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting example of a kind of unexpected or unanticipated consequence of a change in the system. I was sort of thinking about this a little bit, whether you know, from our perspective, you know, from myself sitting in a research centre on the Sunshine Coast, I probably wouldn't have predicted that. But if you probably spoke to the local people in that city in Thailand, they may have been thinking, what's going to happen when the tourists go? You know, so that would be interesting. And I think it's why it's so important to speak to stakeholders and speak to users and make sure that you're getting the right perspectives on a problem, and that you're not sort of, you know, as experts sitting back and trying to predict everything. So it's about getting those diverse views into any analysis, which is really important. We have a range of kind of methods that we use to look at complex systems that sort of take different approaches. Some of them will look at, you know, the decisions and actions of different people in a system and how they interact to create a situation. So I guess in that sense, we could have, if we were thinking about this problem, you know, or this situation in Thailand where we have people feeding monkeys and the monkeys become dependent on humans, we could have looked at, you know, the decisions of tourists to feed monkeys, the decisions of maybe tourist operators to advertise that experience and kind of create an economic benefit from that experience. We could be looking at, you know, whether government put any controls around, you know, that idea of tourists engaging with wildlife and impacting on their kind of ways of gaining food. And then, you know, even broader, we could be sort of looking at like maybe the monkey's natural habitat has probably been affected by human impact. So you could kind of actually map all of those things across a system with hindsight and sort of say these things caused it. But in terms of predicting it or kind of looking into the future of this sort of thing, it would be really interesting to use methods that look at the kind of dynamic nature of systems. So we're starting to use methods like system dynamics and agent-based modelling, where you can actually put in, if you can pull out the key variables that kind of drive a system's behaviour, you can start to simulate that over time. And I feel like if you had one of those models that had said, you know, there's tourists, you know, the number of tourists who then feed the monkeys, the amount of natural food environment available for the monkeys and the monkey population. And then you could kind of simulate that and then say, all right, let's say we take out the tourists, what happens to that system?
Yeah,
and you'd very quickly see that there's going to be a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so I guess let's try and extrapolate those lessons to where we're at now.
I think it's
sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's a really good point, because when I looked at that monkey video, my first thought was, gosh, some things you just can't predict. But Gemma makes a really good point, is that sometimes you don't need to do complex modelling to predict things if you just actually just understand the user or the local area a bit better, and actually just have those discussions with people. So whilst things look sort of unusual to predict, the modelling doesn't necessarily have to be that sophisticated. It could just be going to ask that person, what do you think, what are you concerned about? What are you worried about? And then no doubt somebody would say, yeah, look, there's I'm worried because the monkeys are already pretty aggressive and they're starting to look a little bit hungry. I'm worried what's going to happen next. And, you know, so it's a good lesson, I guess, to consult with, you know, the people who are affected locally.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Minister for Tourism in Bangkok, where there's not, I don't think, a massive monkey population, had have gone out or sent someone out to that particular town, or indeed many, many towns in Thailand, and had a conversation with them. They probably could have anecdotally got that information quite easily. So it's not necessarily that complex. Mark, were you going to come in with a point there? I think I saw someone else.
Yeah, it might have been an involuntary body movement, but yeah, what occurred to me is this. I was really interested listening to Gemma talking about agent-based modelling and how you choose what the attributes are, or the variables that you're going to choose to focus on. I was really surprised recently, excuse me, to understand via the social media, actually, that the COVID era over the last 3 months. Now, we know that there's been a reduction in air pollution because we can extrapolate from some very straightforward, sort of not modelling, but just some very straightforward facts that we're all aware of. Internal combustion engines, exhausts, and so forth. You know, the scope for travel and movement has been greatly inhibited. What's really interesting is that if you go on the sort of abstraction hierarchy up to, so what's the consequence of that, and so what, and what does it lead to? You get to some of these understandings that have been measured by the World Health Organization, for example. Over the last 3 months, I can't ratify these figures, but I'm fairly confident in them. I trust them, using one of those political themes we were talking about earlier. That there's been about 700,000 saved premature child fatalities from respiratory illness worldwide over the last 3 months. Now, who'd have thought that? This modelling approach, I think, to the interdependencies between lots of multifaceted variables within systems, I think there's enormous import for the future. And if you bounce out to the policy level as to what we're going to fund in terms of long-term research that will influence policies, that's really important. Now, I could go on, but I won't, because others can talk much better about, for instance, climate policy. But I did want to just chip in at this stage, listening to Gemma, because there are some systems, we're talking about forecasting somewhat, I think. There are some systems dynamics that are reflective of what's happened in the past. We've got precedents for them. We know 100 years ago we had a big pandemic, and now we've got another one. But these unprecedented changes, like climate change and ecosystem disruptions, we don't actually have precedents for them because we didn't have an overpopulated human ecosystem ever before, but we do now. I'll hand back to you, Cam.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Mark. I'm going to go over to Sai in just a moment and talk about experience design. Did anyone else want to weigh in there before we do that?
Just want to pinpoint to something that Gemma was mentioning before. I think absolutely right. Sometimes a lot of organizations right now and practitioners like us usually have a very standard what if set of questions. Whenever we're doing some pieces of work, we'll have a set of what ifs, because they're generally in the realm of predictability and generally in the realm of possibly happening, But now that list has drastically changed. The what ifs have gone, something that used to be hypothetical suddenly becomes, well, there's a higher likelihood of it happening because of the environment we're in now. I think the lens of the criteria of determining what is a what if has now become, it's not a what if, it's just more like when is it going to happen. So what if tourists don't come to Bangkok and the monkeys go, oh, that's never going to happen, but then it did. So suddenly it puts into questions our list of decisions in that list of what ifs. So I find that systems analysis quite interesting. Yeah,
absolutely. And maybe this is a nice segue to talk to you, Sai, actually, on experience design. And we have another great clip. I'm loving the clips we have today. I think that should be ready for us to go in a moment. It's a real classic. I love it when I can bring The Simpsons into a work discussion. Sai, a lot of us are working from home at the moment, right? And not everyone's working from home, and I think that's probably something we should get to as well. That's maybe the fantasy of working from home, right? Has it been that awesome for absolutely everybody?
So firstly, full credit to the opposite team for selecting that. I think that might have been a little bit of influence from Nick himself, because he's a Simpsons fan. Love Simpsons. And so in terms of a fantasy perspective, absolutely, for me personally, absolutely. Only because there's really, when you think about it from us, we have the luxury of a lot of people on the webinar right now, they're watching us communicate through a panelist of 9, just 8 of us just having a chat about this particular environment. And a lot of people who are watching the webinars are probably watching from home. Now, when you look at the dream is when you are in the workplace and you're watching a video or a webinar, the amount of scrutiny that you might get is slightly different to when you have the luxury of doing it from home. So what I'm alluding towards is the level of flexibility has slightly changed in terms of the workplace environment, especially for people who are working from home. Now, I'll get to your point though, Cameron. I definitely 100% acknowledge for the people who are working on the front lines that don't have that luxury option to do so. So full kudos to them. And I think every one of us 100% respects their work and what they're doing for us. But for us who have that kind of luxury, that's one thing that has changed, the flexibility component. But what comes with that is the element of trust as well, right? We have that dream of being able to work from home, but then the whole element of how does that figure when it comes to our supervisors or the managers or other employees? Do they trust that we're going to do what we said we're going to do just because we're working from home? So sure, you see Homer dancing with Marge, epic. I would love to do that, my wife. But one of the things there is, does it ever cross in their minds? They go, oh, hold on, should I be doing this? The guilt factor comes in. So that's a slight change as well in terms of the dream of working from home. It just comes with the whole raft of different things there.
I already worked from home a bit, so for me it was a fairly smooth transition. It was just something I was doing more of. I kind of missed the interaction of teaching, for example, or going in, interacting with colleagues. One friend said to me, you know, flexibility is an interesting word. It can work both ways, and at least in the early days of the pandemic, they felt that their employer kind of had a captive audience. They knew they were at home, even on a Friday night. Like, where else could they be? So perhaps that temptation to send the email at 7 or 8 o'clock on a Friday night and maybe expect a response, you know, rather than leaving until Monday morning. You know, maybe that's heightened in the situation. And is it a temporary thing, or is that something that we might be stuck with going forward?
Well, that's a fantastic point, because really what's highlighted, and I'm all for simplification. So with Nick, is the three things that we start to see, mentioned before, the trust element. So trust itself has changed. The principles of working from home and working in a physical environment, that has changed as well. So all the different etiquettes that you used to have in the workplace, in the physical workplace, has now slightly changed when it comes to home. So is it okay to send an email at 7 p.m.? So there could be some set of principles and things that need to be put, especially boundaries, that has changed because of the environment we're in. The last one is more, so you've got the boundaries and you've got the trust element that has changed. But then one thing is, we all have to accept that because we are now in this particular environment, a lot of the things that was considered taboo, or from what we look from a leadership side, has slightly changed. We now yearn for a little bit of certainty. We now yearn for a little bit of understanding that our leaders, not only do they empathize with us, but they're also understanding that we have a whole heap of new things to deal with. I remember when we, as employees, when we're traveling to work, you've got that commute time, and you're at work, there's a really solid boundary. Everyone picks up the phone, they know SAIFUL's at work, they know all of you guys at a physical location, they can reach you at work. And when you come home, that's it, I've got a boundary and that's my time. And we want leaders to also understand that has not really changed, because although I'm waking up and walking 2 steps to my computer, that's still a boundary. That's still trust.
It can even change the way you think about your own home, depending on the kind of space you've got. I mean, I kind of have a room, like a home office, that I can use, and then I can literally, I've noticed actually more and more, I close the door at the end of the day, whereas I might not have bothered doing that. But I know plenty of other people who literally have a desk set up in the corner of their bedroom, and that sort of brings up a whole thing about recreational space versus workspace and that sort of thing. I think we might, in a moment, ask the audience if they have any questions at this point. I see one come up in the Q&A. I'll get to that in a second. I just wonder, Sai, while I do that transition, do you want to briefly speak about experience design itself, how we can, I guess, situate that in this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to experience design, and I'm talking about some of the stuff that we've been doing, also the research that we've been doing as well. When you look at it from 3 lenses, the employee's experience, the customer's experience, and the individual's experience within the context of society and how they interact, all their experiences have slightly changed, but based on 3 things. The elements of boundaries have changed. The principles of experience design has changed. And then just the trust factor has changed. So what I mean by that is, when you look at a customer's journey, their interactions with different brands as they go through their day and to solve a particular problem, that journey has changed for them. What used to be a ratio of 20% of a particular channel has now jumped to 80% when it comes to online channels. So as experience designer, especially in my guys, we start to look at ways that how has the pandemic changed the general principles of how people engage with organizations, the trust and the boundaries that it's already put into them when they're making decisions as a customer. For an employee, that's also the same as well. As we looked at Homer before, I bet you there's no chance in hell that he's going to dance in the middle of the nuclear power plant, right? So there's the boundaries have changed. Again, experience designer will have to look at employee experience as onboarding and recruiting has changed. The way that you enforce policies or employee policies has also changed. And in terms of us as a responsible person within the society, that has also changed as the experience designer. So we've worked with government organizations looking at experience design from a citizen perspective. And if we were to revisit that, a lot of those things have also changed as well in terms of how they make decisions, what do they do in terms of their guidelines and boundaries, and also the trust factor of citizens. I mean, if you looked at some of the speeches and you've seen before, government themselves have to also adopt that trust, right? To see that there are certain pockets of the society that's going to do the right thing, but still enforce elements. So there's, from an experience design, those three elements that we've seen coming up more and more when we're looking at designing new experiences.
Okay, thanks. We have a couple of options for checking in with the audience now with questions. One is simply that you raise your hand. It should be a fairly simple thing to do. So I'm going to check in on that at the moment and give maybe one or two people the opportunity at this stage to come on screen. I do have a question in the Q&A feature from David Chong, and I just want to make sure that I'm doing this question justice, David. So I'm going to read it out as I see it written, and if you want to clarify it, please jump in and do so. You actually have the option of raising your hand and coming up on camera. Your question is, how do you think COVID-19 has affected management who subscribe to Theory X? From what you have observed, how have they adapted? So I'm assuming Theory X, correct me if I'm wrong, if it does refer to an actual theory called X, and I'm the dummy here, or whether it refers to the subscription to theory in a more general sense. Who on the panel feels they can jump in on that one?
Well, I'm assuming Theory X, because Theory X is sometimes refers to as just more controlling people from surveillance and accountability and control rather than inspiration and that sort of thing. And just very briefly, my concern is that because managers didn't have as much control over their employees during this time, they're often finding more creative ways of controlling. So if anything, that sort of, it actually can sometimes amplify that need. So it'll be interesting to see whether actually the next sort of 6 months to 1 year increases trust, or as I'm predicting, may actually create the opposite problem.
Yeah, interesting. Anyone else on that? Enlighten me.
Yeah. I was just going to mention, I mean, I've heard talk about some workplaces bringing in more sort of IT-based surveillance in terms of what people are doing on their computers. There's also, you know, the normal things we use like Skype for Business that can show whether you're, you know, at the computer or not. Like, I sort of wonder if some of those things are starting to be used by some leaders, and how, and what Simon was saying, maybe we'll actually, you know, we'll have a worse problem. I mean, I hope it's not. I hope that we do all kind of increase that trust, because I think most, you know, in most organisations, it's been shown that people are just as productive in this time, or even more productive. I've certainly seen some of my colleagues do amazing amounts of work at the moment. So yeah.
I was just going to say as well that I think this is something I've discovered as well in running my own business, is that sometimes and this right at the beginning of starting, I was working with someone who was very used to working in the office, doing sort of more the 9 to 5 job. And in our consultancy, it was more dynamic. You can basically work wherever you want. And they basically made an assumption that I wanted them to be sitting there working next to them every day. And they'd always check in with me to say, is it okay if I don't come in today? Is it okay? Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? And so sometimes I reckon that there's actually implied monitoring. So people actually believe that their managers or their leaders or supervisors are actually worried about them. But potentially that actually might be, it could actually, some of it might actually be in our minds. that we actually might be creating some angst for ourselves, and that the leaders actually don't feel that way at all. They actually do trust you. So, and maybe this is something more open to the panel, is what could a leader actually do? Maybe Simon, you've got some tips, or some of the others. What could you actually do to actually give people confidence that that isn't the case? And also, not to mention the fact that I've had managers before who definitely have said things like, oh, I don't care, work from home, but sometimes there is some implied subtext there. Or maybe that was just me being paranoid.
Yeah, well, may I just jump in very briefly there? It's ringing a big bell with me, because we've all heard about how some of the really successful global companies around the world have tried to formalize this freedom or latitude over modes of work, and recognizing that there are different types of work. You know, some people are just terrific at administration. Thank goodness, because I'm not. And other people derive enormous benefit from staring vacantly out of the window, because that's one of the avenues to creativity and coming up with new stuff. And how on earth would you monitor or meter those styles of work, and why would you want to? It goes right back to this thing we started off with about trust. And just like we would like to trust politicians, then leadership, middle managers, supervisors, and ourselves need to all trust ourselves. So yeah, it comes back to, you know, the way we measure work. The way we measure work is really interesting. I work with a lot of engineers from time to time, and they often churn out risk assessments like chain link sausages, and they measure their productivity by how many risk assessments and how many risks they came up with. A bit like software companies in the 90s used to measure their productivity by lines of code. I mean, how ridiculous. Thereby inflating the units of work by measuring the wrong thing, essentially. Back to you, Kim.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. Okay, a little pivoting here. Firstly, SAWSAN, I wanted to ask if you had any perspectives on this in particular, because some of it seems to be speaking to your area, and then I'm going to move on to taking a question from the audience, I think.
Thank you. What I would say about the role of leadership in monitoring or measuring or qualifying or quantifying production from employees really talks to what is it that the leader thinks that they're there to do. So if your proposition as a leader is to say, I'm here to get the best out of my people, and what are the relevant conversations I would need to have with them, or what are the relevant constructs that I need to put in place for them to enable them to do their best work, is different from how many risk assessments did you churn out today, or how many lines of code, or how many hours did you spend in front of your machine. So the liberation, the decision of a leader to say, I'm here to create an environment whereby we all produce our best work in whatever circumstance you need that to be, is a different mindset, I think.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is very interesting. It's so interesting. I keep wanting to go down these little rabbit warrens or rabbit holes with different people, but I'm going to try and bring in Gregory, who's in the audience, to ask a question. So just bear with me for a moment. Gregory, I'm about to bring you up on screen. I'm hoping that you're comfortable with that, and then you should be able to ask us your question. So you should have just been sent an invitation. Gregory is with us. Gregory, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Or do I need to do that for you?
That's all right. I can do that.
Okay, Gregory, you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Yep, my name's Gregory, or Greg Dellis. Hello, panel. Just reflecting on a number of things that are being said there. I am a pre-pandemic work from home person, and have been working from home at least 1 day a week for the last 12 years since my daughter was born, because I was helping, being sort of a bit more of a hands-on parent. I do work in the sort of a crossover not-for-profit space. I'm now with a commercial organisation, but we serve the not-for-profit space. So probably had a little more flexibility than in the dog-eat-dog commercial world. But certainly the point that's being discussed now around working from home and the trust and the leadership that shows, I think historically we've been, this is probably more of an observation than a question, but historically we have been brought up in a command and control structure, right? You must obey, you must do this, we must check you, whether it's at school, from a homework perspective, or it's not until you fail the first 3 courses at university that you kind of figured out that you've actually got to do stuff for yourself and you have to be independent. And so from that perspective, I think our cultural controls are not aligned to actually building that sort of trust and working on outcomes rather than, you know, signing into the logbook the number of lines of code. And time again, I think if we go to the research, it's shown that when you measure the wrong things, you get the wrong performance, because people, whether that's corruption, whether that's, you know, commissions, whether that's whatever, when you're measuring the wrong things, you get the wrong outcomes. And I think the fact that we've transitioned reasonably well, I think, into a working from home environment within the pressure of a COVID environment shows that we can actually do it. And maybe we need a mindset change from early education, right? Not just in management, but to get to that point. So is this a transitional change? A generational change? I
guess that's a question for the whole panel, right? So
yeah, it's just
feel free to jump in there, panel. I can see some nodding heads, some
Thanks,
consideration
Gregory.
going on there. SAWSAN, did you want to kick off on that?
I'd love to, thank you. And you raised such a good point about mindset shifts. What I think COVID-19 has done is to simultaneously, pardon me, legitimize working from home. And when I say that, it's because people who traditionally would never have typically worked from home, say C-suite or chief executives, have now all necessarily in the main have had to do it, and they found that it works and they understand what it's all about now. The technology isn't great, but it will catch up over time. So this notion of being able to productively, where your job type allows, work productively remotely, not necessarily from home, I think has the potential to completely unwind one of the megatrends that we've been seeing for several decades now, which is around global urbanisation. So 87% of the world's population, 87% of the world's population is urbanised. Now, a megatrend is something that happens on a huge global scale and is typically irreversible. Now, COVID-19 means that we are no longer shackled to going in and out of the CBD anymore, potentially. I choose not to. I don't miss the commute. Who does? Now, with increasing populations, of course, more and more cars on the road, more and more people on trains. It's not a very pleasant construct. No one misses it. Now, at the same time, governments keep pouring more and more money into infrastructure, don't they? If I was to ask the panel or anyone listening to this, if you were to estimate what is the infrastructure deficit that we have here in Australia, what number would you put it at? Have a guess. Give me a number. Anyone? I'll tell you, I'll put you out of your misery. Conservatively, $700 billion is the present infrastructure deficit in Australia. 700 billion. Infrastructure Australia estimates it closer at 1,000 billion. Now, a lot of that is because we are wedded to this construct of in and out of the city all the time, needing more roads, needing more buildings, needing more everything. Now, what COVID-19 has done is to say, well, in fact, you know your dream of being out in the country and working somewhere serene? You can have that now, technology permitting. If you wanted to be up in the mountains or by the ocean and still work for a big pharmaceutical company or a big infrastructure company, etc., you can do that. Now, many psychologists and you guys on the panel, my learned colleagues, will probably say, oh yes, but what about the nuancing of the human interaction? How will we ever substitute that? And what about all the incidental interactions I have, as you said, Si, yesterday, going from the train station to my work? And what about all those retailers that I'm not going to go by and pop in and get my coffee or whatever it is anymore? Well, what about the proposition that if we were to disperse from urban centres, not only is that more affordable from a housing perspective, but we create new connections in these places. You don't have to forego your humanity just because you're not in your regular routine anymore. So I actually think that we may not go back ever really to the full pre-COVID, construct of work that we had.
This is great. I think we'll come back to this. So, hold on to the thoughts. I want to go to one question. We'll try to keep it fairly quick from Nick Pessell. Apologise if I'm butchering people's names here. Then we're going to go to Mark to talk about work design, which I think flows on really nicely from this discussion we're having. So, Nick, I'm about to promote you to panellist. As you come on, please introduce yourself, tell us what your affiliation is, and fire away with your question. Nick, you're on screen now. You just need to unmute yourself. If you choose to come up on camera, if you prefer to stay off camera, that's fine. No, I'm not. I haven't got Nick. I can't hear you. Go ahead now, Nick. You're off mute.
Sorry, guys. How are you going?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Nick.
It wasn't so much of a question I had. It was just more of a comment, just about what was it SAIFUL brought up about the guilt factor, people working from home with the management structure. People still have that old school thought process that if you can't be seen, you must not be working. But a lot of it has changed. The whole mindset shift has changed, and people are more accepting. And I think it comes down to no longer micromanaging employees, letting them go their own breath and come back with the results of what's needed for their position. So I think it's a good change, and hopefully it will continue. And yeah, we won't, as Ms. Swanson said, about all needing to come back to the city. We can then live in the places where we want and work from home, provided the technology keeps up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. Simon, did you want to speak to that, or anybody else at all?
Well, just briefly, I certainly agree. Probably the only caveat I'd say is that still people feel the need to prove that they are working and productive. And as a consequence, they often feel the need to complete work that's quite tangible. And usually that's very appropriate. But occasionally it means things like, for example, managers often impeding more than they should, feeling the need to sort of show that they're working. And sometimes that can actually sort of compromise the autonomy of the people they're working with. So there might be sort of complications with that trust as well, but I'm sure we'll be able to address those over time.
Yeah, it's really, I'm just I can chime in there. Like, I've certainly had jobs where the culture has been to spend a long amount of time in the office. So again, when I was working in politics, particularly actually when I had pretty junior role starting off, I was there very typically till like 9 o'clock at night, and there was this sort of expectation. A lot of the time I had work to do, but honestly, there were sometimes when I didn't, and part of it was like just, I don't know, it's almost like people remember that show, The West Wing, just that sort of appearance to really trying to impress everybody else, maybe yourself, living that life. You hear stories of like, lawyers, up and coming lawyers sort of in that corporate culture as well, other people too. In some ways, I feel at home I'm being more productive because I'm not having chit chats at the water cooler and, going out for a coffee and doing that. Like, I'm sitting there for like a few solid hours and I'm smashing something out. So.
I was going to say that is I always remember the psychological effect of the need for closure with these things, because there's this sort of sense that people don't like things sort of left hanging, and so especially when you get towards the end of the day, I think there's a real danger for everyone actually to make decisions right at the end of the day just to get the monkey off their back, because it's like, oh, now I don't have to worry about it. And the classic one I've discovered with that one is you get to the end of the week, and how many people have been look at their emails on a Friday afternoon, all of a sudden they fill up with things that have been thrown into your lap, problems and things that ruin your weekend because you've got to think about them. And I always look at that as, well, people basically just want to get stuff done and feel like they've got this sense of accomplishment. So I completely agree that, it completely undermines a bit of that creativity and autonomy. when you're sort of focused on, well, I've got to deliver an email, or I've got to make a decision, or I've got to produce a document in order to sort of justify, not only to other people, but many times I think you're justifying it to yourself so that you can feel more relaxed.
Yeah.
As from an experience design perspective, we've seen that the common recurring theme here, and also to go into what both Nicks were talking about, was the whole element of trust. I think everyone's honed in on that element of trust and how that needs to evolve. The trust that you want to do the right thing, the trust that you're doing something that achieving an outcome that's been bestowed upon you, right? So the three elements that organizations need to start setting principles and then setting boundaries around those principles, and just trust that their work is going to be operating within that. And to what Nick Pierce or what you're pointing towards, I think that's a massive, there is going to be a change, and I hope it changes even further. If you're talking about adapting and evolving, I hope that as part of the evolving part, that organizations start to realize that because it's outcome driven, it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're in Australia, you can't do work that an American company has, for example. Suddenly that whole element of trust is like, I used to be localized in terms of making decisions for my recruitment or for my candidates. But now, if I find the right person for the right job, it could be such a global, all the boundaries start to diminish. And suddenly you start engaging with people. Thank you, Nick and Greg, for the questions. They've been really insightful.
Yeah.
And that whole trust, suddenly it starts diminishing certain boundaries that physical and localized employment and working has set up before. And now we're getting touches by people overseas to go, can you do this, since we're going to be remote anyway, you don't have to fly in. So that change, I think that's the evolution part from this whole thing that's happening. We're adapting right now, but I think the evolution is, hopefully, fingers crossed, the global boundaries start to diminish.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mark in a moment. I do have some really good questions coming up in the Q&A box. I'm just going to touch on one of them right now, maybe get a couple of quick responses, then go to Mark on work design. I'm sorry to keep you waiting, Mark, but I'm going to touch on this one from Joe Chang. In New Zealand, there's an increasing focus on getting CBDs going again. So continued work from home is meaning that in some centres, businesses will continue to struggle, whilst other businesses in the suburbs are doing well. I can see this as generating a great deal of stress. Ideas on how our leaders should respond to this. Presumably, the business in the CBD needs to know that the previous business model may not work. Should we be monitoring business and individuals' intentions? This is a really interesting one for Australia as well, and it's always good to get a New Zealand perspective. So did someone want to speak to that before I move on to Mark?
Well,
Mark, the perfect person to speak to, then we can say.
Okay, there was a little bit of a dead air there, so I thought I'd jump in.
Okay.
I think what SAWSAN was saying actually answers your question somewhat, because the change, for instance, in the magnet of the CBD for work and play and theatre and everything, has been weakened. And interestingly, what that will probably do in a trickle-down type of effect will change capital structures. SAWSAN went into good detail there about, we make these long decade horizon decisions about infrastructure, and there's a whole marshalling of lots of businesses and institutions around that, superannuation funds, foreign investors, even sovereign wealth, starts jostling around power stations and tollways and things like that. Now, if the meaning and the value of these things has been inverted by this wonderful lesson of digital transformation that we've been gifted, and I hear that many of you started this digital transformation journey way before COVID. We've been, probably nearly all of us have been working from home for a long time. So I think in many ways I'm just trying to make some links to some of the panelists' earlier comments, because it does sort of answer that. There's some big unknowns here. And going back to Sai's comment about trust, we've seen again in a structural way how trust has been reframed. For instance, in the regulatory environment, there's regulators all over the world that are moving from a policing culture to a coaching culture. We know that. Now, why would they think that was a useful thing to do? Well, it's because the power of trust liberates creativity and how people achieve performance outcomes. So there's no longer a prescription for certain regulatory environments like safety or energy or something, but there is a performance basis by which organizations reorganize themselves to achieve that outcome. Back to you, Ken.
Okay, this is a great place to jump into some further discussion with you, Mark. We have another awesome clip lined up, which I'm looking forward to. Let's run that now.
Do I need a seatbelt? I don't? Okay, here we go. Oh, dude. All right, we are here with Che Voigt, co-founder and CEO of, look at what I have behind me, the Alt Desk Station. This is nothing you've ever seen before. I've never seen anything like this. And Che, first of all, can you tell us, when someone looks at this, how would you sum up something like this when they first see this?
So talking about the Alt Workstation, so it is the entire environment for working in your personal workspace. What we are trying to do is develop a much more productive environment for people that use the computer as their primary professional tool. We have the standing mode, we have regular sitting mode, we have collaboration mode, we have our reclined focus mode. So first thing I want to show, because this is something that a lot of people...
Whoa, what's going on here? How is this glued on? What's going on here?
This surface is steel. We put the magnets in the peripherals.
Got it.
So the magnets...
Okay. Well, so I've had the standing desk. I guess most of us have probably had the standing desk. Mark, what do you think of this? Is this where we're headed?
Well, it's a sort of a dystopian future, isn't it? Where we're all essentially, I mean, you could take this dude and basically plumb him in, you know, put a drip put a drip in for nutrients and plumb the other end in, and he becomes a hikikomori. That's the Japanese word for a technology homebound hermit, of which they're bound. And we really don't want to encourage the normalization of this type of thing. I mean, where did somebody think it was a good idea to ask your musculature to do no work? You know, to relieve, just from an ergonomics point of view, you know, the pressures and stresses. Now, we want to get movement into everyday life as much as possible. So that's my first comment. My second comment is in that, pardon me, in that clip, there was reference to, you know, the computer for many people is your primary work tool. No, it isn't. Languages. Language, communication, and the ability to listen and to understand and to converse and weigh ideas and concepts. That's your primary tool, I would suggest. Not the computer. Computer is, you know, a mediating device. Of course, we know that the computing is going to continue to explode in importance.
Yeah.
When we move into the SaaS world, SaaS, that's software as a service. Where we, instead of selling IT boxes, we're selling literally access to the ability to communicate better. And a transfer, you know, we're using one now, software as a service. And the clever thing about it, which eclipses these focuses on a physical workstation by a country mile, the focus is on the user, the organization, being able to configure their business to the software as a service. Now, they're not changing the code of the software, because if they did that, they would uncouple the ability to take versions, you know, as the software as a service started to recognize, say, machine learning or the Internet of Things, and the business started to see how that would work much, much better. For instance, with Zoom. What we're then into is the cognitive and more organizational aspects of work design. So the ergonomics of what you sit, lie, stand, or whatever with is fairly straightforward. We don't really need to go to school to learn that. You know, the ability to move and have flexibility and to be able to adapt as to whether you're at the dining room table or in your car is fairly self-evident. The focus really needs to be, as all the panelists are experienced in and working on, is on the cognitive and communicative aspects of work design.
In terms of trends, Nick, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was going to ask Mark, because this is something I've seen a bit myself, you no doubt as well, is that there seems to be like an assumption perhaps then in that, even in that video and in many sort of workplaces, that ergonomics is about comfort. That's one thing, like essentially it's there to make you as comfortable and as relaxed as possible. And the other one that sort of is an implied thing in a lot of workplaces that are working on motivation and engagement is that the purpose of doing things for employees, positive things for employees, is to make them feel happy. So like user experience is often captured. People kind of think we want to create sort of happy and enjoyable experiences. And even in people's language, like when people talk about what the meaning of life is, quite often there's a bit of a cliche people use, is I think the purpose of life is to be happy, you know, that kind of cliche. And you sort of wonder, there's a lot of these assumptions about what's good for a person. Is comfort, is happiness? Well, perhaps, yeah, to a point, but I think what you're getting at is there's something else that technology or that environment is trying to create. So if you were to define what that is, what do you think that might be?
Yeah. Whew. Wouldn't we all love to know the answer to that one? Look, excellent points, Nick. The issue of happiness, you know, poets, philosophers have waxed on this, and I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole, because we know that happiness is not the answer. Alan de Botton has got some fantastic videos on this. There are much more meaningful dimensions of the lived experience than being happy. Being happy all the time, it could be pretty wretched. You know, it's a little bit like the old absent-minded dilemma. You know, we don't want people to be absent-minded if they're flying an aircraft, but we certainly don't want them to be present-minded. 100% present-minded, you go mad. So coming back to comfort, I'm actually working on comfort at the moment. And it's really interesting if you try and tease out the dimensions of comfort. I'll tell you, the literature is not very helpful, because really comfort, by many definitions, is the absence of discomfort. It's one of the closest ways you can get to it. Sort of, if you don't notice things, you're better off. Over-focusing on being comfortable or being happy could be the bane of your existence. There are much more meaningful rushes to get from overexertion and the thrill of discovery and creating new things and those types of things. For some people, there are some people that actually really need a quiet space and they don't want to engage with what's next. So I'm going a little bit round in circles there. Excellent question. I don't think comfort, I haven't touched on psychological comfort, of course, but, you know, feelings of safety in employees. We have some legal instruments that govern how we have to take care of employees. And we want to be careful of going down the policing side of bullying, stress, trauma, and all those types of things, because what will happen is it will deaden efforts to liberate people's joy of, the joy of work, if you like.
I think in terms of,
yeah, go ahead,
Mark, thank
Can
you.
Just before I let you go, SAWSAN, just as a housekeeping thing, I'm going to move on to Marvin in
oh, yes, of course.
moment, straight after you, and then we'll move to you, indeed, and then we'll go throw open our remaining time to Q&A. So please go ahead, SAWSAN.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Mark, the points you make about SaaS, software as a service, and the rise of the FANGs, as we call them, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Netflixes, the Googles, etc., really talks to that. So what you get from those platforms is either a sense of connection, continuity, family, love, etc., that you might find in Facebook versus the tailored experience you might get on Netflix when it recommends shows for you on the basis of what you've enjoyed in the past, or the almost instant gratification you might get from Amazon. I think all those software is certainly coming up against the human experience as far as the things that we kind of want to feel and experience.
Thank you, SAWSAN. Marvin, I'll bring you in now, if that's okay. Your background is in neurobehavioral modeling and behavioral change technologies. You're speaking to us today on second order change. And I just wondered if for my benefit at least, we could start with something really basic and you could talk us through what second order change actually is.
Thanks, Cam. Yeah, my particular lens is on three things. And just also, by the way, as a background, I've just been biting at the bit, wanting to jump in. I didn't want to distract a lot of people on a range of different rabbit holes, as you said, because there's so many places. Conversation is so rich. There's so much to talk about. First, when a great philosopher of our time, Gregory Bateson, often mentioned around what he called the pattern that connects. And I've been trying to find the pattern that connects between what all the panelists have been saying as well as the questions coming through. And it's a lot of what my work actually is. I work from three different lenses. And the first lens is around second order change. So second order change is a bit of terminology, and it's building on a lot of systems approaches. And perhaps the best way to understand second order change is to first contrast it with first order change. So first order change is any change inside of a system, any system or paradigm or culture or whatever mindset, whatever lens you want to particularly use, but any change inside of it. So I've discovered over the years that there are at least 4 types of first order change, and it's particularly seductive. So the first type is improvement. So any good improvement makes the system better, but the system is still operating the way that it is, but it's better. And there's nothing wrong with good first order change if the system itself is not problematic. The second type of first order change is much ado about nothing. We would have all seen it, large organizations making lots of changes, and at the end of the day, status quo prevails. The third type of first order change is a fix. It's the system was working, it's no longer working as well. Let's fix it, and we get it back to the way it was. And you might think, well, yeah, in some ways, that's nothing wrong with that. But yes, it depends. It depends as long as the system's not problematic. A good example of where it can be problematic, for instance, is people's health. A lot of people have a remedial approach to health, and their version of health, or when they need to look at their health issues, has more to do with when they're feeling not well and they want to get back to the way they were. And either fix my back or let me get rid of this symptom, without recognizing that the way that they were being, and the choices that they were making, etc., is probably what produced a lot of their issues in the first place. So you sort of don't want to necessarily get back to where you were. You do want to evolve. And the last type is where changes actually make the system harder to evolve, where what happens is you actually reinforce in a self-organizing system. The core balancing loops get reinforced, and it's even harder to make changes. A classic example of this is our election cycles. As long as the election cycles continue on and people chase popularity votes, every time we just keep shifting the names and faces, it makes it harder for any real change to actually occur, because we're just perpetuating the system. It's just harder to move now. Yeah. So second order change is a change to the system, where the system itself, or the culture itself, or the paradigm itself evolves. And in order to do that, when we're not talking about mechanical systems, we're talking about living systems. And it comes back to what Gemma was saying around object-based modeling, where we start to look at a living system that's self-organizing. Now we're starting to find that what does it actually take for a system to actually reorganize, evolve at a higher order of functioning, where there's greater ecology, there's better systemic ecology occurring in the way the system is behaving. So I look for second order change agents, second order leaders, second order ways of thinking. Now for that, for humans to get to there, I use neurobehavioral modeling as a methodology. What neurobehavioral modeling is, there's another lens, is essentially we look at forms of human expertise, and our job is essentially try to replicate it. Now, the challenge is all forms of human expertise require processes outside the awareness of the expert. So even if I just said to you, wiggle your fingers, and I said, how do you do that? No one can really answer. You hold up your hand and you wiggle your fingers. So we look at for things that actually occur, essentially what Bateson calls the difference that makes a difference. We look for things that actually allow humans to perform at for lack of better terms, at levels of superior performance. So I'm particularly interested in things of complex decision-making, things that increase the level of wisdom in decision-making, real systemic evolution. And the third lens is generative learning, which is how does a human actually do that? How do we evolve our consciousness? A lot of the conversations, for instance, so far have been around things like mindset, trust, etc. Well, it's one thing to say we need to do that. It's a whole other thing to actually upgrade between the years where we actually can do that. And so I look at these behavioral modeling to find methodologies or create methodologies that allow people to do what's called vertical change. And so, well, as you'll hear when I'm talking, I'll use a lot of different labels. As a great cyberneticist of our time, Stafford Beer said, he said, if you want to change a system, every system is somewhat problematic. And he said, in order to shift the system, you cannot use the language of the system. You have to use a language about the system. You need a meta language. And so things like systems thinking and things of like the heuristics that Simon's talking about, things that what Mark was saying around, this language is our core thing. That's absolutely right. It's the way we're mapping our world determines whether or not we're going to go in a first order move coming out of COVID or whatever else is happening around the world, or whether we actually evolve first between the ears, then upgrade all our rules of how we behave, and therefore how we actually change out there in the world. And there's a lot of distinctions that now come into play. So having said that, there's quite a few things I can comment on. So for instance, as SAIFUL has pointed out, so much of the conversation now around the trust issue. And someone mentioned, I think in the chat, around controls. If we go back to, as Marcus said, let's go back to looking at the language. Trust is a great one, right? In terms of how well we're going to evolve or not evolve, because if we don't trust, we go into a fear response. And the things that we do know out of neuroscience today is as soon as we go into a fear response, we go into a reactive mode. And as soon as we go into a reactive mode, our first instinct is protect and defend. And as long as we protect, first of all, what are we protecting and defending? We are protecting and defending our status quo of what was. And as long as we're protecting and defending, the one thing we're not doing is creating and evolving. And so when we start looking at, we have mistrust or distrust issues, we got fear-based issues. So this is the first call to second order leadership, which is the generative learning side. There's a huge level of personal development and personal evolution that needs to occur. Huge doses of self-awareness that needs to happen. They have to reach for meta language about the ways they're processing, about the ways that they're perceiving the world, so that they can make better decisions out there. So we have wiser decision making. We have better leadership that will come into play. Now, the trust issue. So what people do when they are in fear is they reach for their notions of control. Now, why do we want control? Because we're fearful. What happens if it goes out of control? Well, we don't have predictable results. Now, all the rules have changed. So all the rules are changing now. We're starting to go, well, if people are now working out away from home, what constitutes control? Well, what doesn't constitute control is micromanaging. Transactional observations does not constitute control. What can we control? Well, really, as someone mentioned previously, what we can control or what we can monitor are things like outcomes. And Stafford Beer pointed this out. He had language around in cybernetics, what we call requisite variety, where you start reaching for things like, well, terrific. People are going to need as many options and as much flexibility as they can to get the job done. Do you care how they do it? Or do you care that it gets done? Well, free them up, let it get done. And what you're trying to orchestrate is conditions that allow people to get the thing done. As people said, freedom to be able to do these things. Now, this requires for a leader to let go of your control-based reactive responses and adopt a new set of rules as to what constitutes leadership or what constitutes work. So some of the things like SAWSAN was saying around, we're now, we don't have to go into this central urbanized approach. Well, this frees up a whole new range of thinking. And for leaders to evolve, one of the first things you have to do is recognize the old rules I had fit an old world, and it made it work back then. Which rules do I now need to let go? Which rules do I now need to start creating because we don't have them yet? I've got to design them. Which ones stay the same? There will be some, as Nick has said, there's some first principles that have to be there. So trust is a great example. It can be both a first principle. Let's just start on the assumption that we're working with good people and they want to do good things. But it's also an emergent property, which is trust will occur out of the relationships we will build with each other. Then other emotional trust factors will start to arise. So it's both ends. It's both a starting point as well as an emergent property that comes out of how the system starts self-organizing. Again, leaders can't do this if they don't have, as Marcus pointed out, they don't have the language. If they don't have a language to talk about the changes, then they're going to reach for what they already know, the language they already know, which makes the same distinctions. It's the language of the current system. And that's where we get first order adaptation rather than second order evolution. So I'm just, like I said, I can go forever in a day, but I'm loving the conversation that's going on, and I could go for hours. So.
You've given us a banquet, and I can already see some observations just in the chat there on this. What I'd like to do is give the panelists an opportunity to respond to that fairly briefly. I know that's hard because it is a banquet there.
Sorry, guys.
No, don't apologize, because you've given us a lot, and it's great. A lot of valuable material. And then I'm going to go to SAWSAN and then sort of use the rest of our time for the audience and take all the questions you've got there. And if you haven't asked a question yet, please go and do so. I'm going to try and work through as many as I can. So firstly, from the panel, points in response to Marvin, observations, any questions on that? There's a lot to choose from.
Just a quickie, yeah. I'm unmuted, yeah. Real quickie, Marvin. Trust is this thread that's been going through a lot of our conversations today. If you look under the hood of trust, you know, I learn a lot from these Scorsese films. You know, if people's interests, if people's interests are aligned, then you've got a motivation for trust. What's your view on if we just don't take trust as a given?
Yes, right.
What is it underneath that actually builds or drives trust?
Yeah, actually, this is a great question, because it's not one thing. One of the things we look at are the neuropsychological aspects of language and what its effects are on both not only the physiological functioning, but also levels of consciousness that will come into play. And, you know, many years ago, trust was also a big issue in organizations, as it still is today. And quickly, as I started to do some neurobehavioral modeling on it, I realized trust isn't, it's a short word, but it's not one thing. There's multiple things that are involved in trust. I could trust, for instance, when I say trust, is it that I'm trusting your competence? Do I trust that you have the ability to do this? Or do I trust your intention? Do I trust what your agenda is actually about? Or do I trust your consistency and reliability, in the sense that, okay, I know you're good and you've done it in this context, but can you do it in this context? Is a different form of trust. Do I trust your because of history, I've seen how you've come through a range of things. So therefore, my trust, when people say I've trust them, it's more like you have confidence. And there's a difference between confidence and trust. So again, there's many different levels of trust that will go into play. But you've highlighted a really important thing, Mark, which is, if we all have aligned interest, then that's going to be a lot easier. But one of the things we do know, there are different ways and different models and maps of what's happening out there, how humans behave, etc. And there are some, while as humans, there are some things fundamental to just being human that we can all align to. In terms of worldviews, in terms of schemas, mental schemas that go on about how people organize their world and the value sets they're in, it is very clear. There are different types of worldviews that are fundamentally in conflict with other worldviews. Right? Now, people will, again, you have this level of in some ways noble, but in other ways naive, which is, but if we can all get together and just all find where we have common ground. Well, some models suggest, again, models are models, so you kind of, use them when they work and jettison them when they don't work. But some models will suggest, but some worldviews will be at fundamental odds and there will be no alignment. And the point is, at any point in society, we will have a mix of those worldviews. So now what do? Is it inherent conflict or not? Well, depends. If you think it should be, that we should be aligned, yeah, there'll be conflict because we won't be. But if you go meta, again, meta language, and you have a way to talk about the fact that we do have differences, and they're not just differences. Some of these are fundamental conflicts at a worldview level, and they're all in play. Now, what does leadership look like? Now what's a way forward in that level of complexity? And it's like, well, great, that's a different question, right? And so rather than thinking about what it should be, let's kind of say, well, let's assume that that's the case. What does political leadership look like now? What does corporate leadership look like now? And I can tell you, and I think we've probably all experienced it, inside of a large family, there's going to be that as well. There'll be family members arguing with each other at some fundamental levels. So, how do you do family now? And these are now I think the more generative questions, the more consciousness-based questions to kind of say, great, how do we have to upgrade our own belief systems about how to actually get along with each other in a world that's now so interdependent, so interfacing, and some parts of the system we'll get along with, some parts of the system will have differences, some parts of the system there'll be fundamental conflict, and we're all as part of this planet. Now,
Marvin, I really liked your deconstruction of the different types of trust, because I was thinking back to the earlier video we were talking about how can leaders actually change their mind or not? Are they allowed to? Are we going to give them license to? Because I think what we were talking about there was when they don't, and when they're inconsistent with their past selves, we start to not trust that they have a value system or something that underpins what they're doing.
Yeah, very much. So one of the major things too is understanding the power of context. So again, from a neurobehavioral modeling side, we start to find that, we have this lovely phrase that all meaning is contextual. And so, as we like to highlight, in case most people are not familiar with that phrase, I highlight it by saying, if a child gets good at taking their shoe off and throwing it at someone's head and knocking them out, is that good or bad behavior? Depends, right? Across the dinner table, bad behavior. If they're chased by an attacker down a dead-end alleyway, hey, it's a ninja skill that will save their life. So is it good or bad? Well, it depends, right? So because people are making meaning based on context, well, things that quote unquote leaders need to be able to recognize as part of their mapping of reality is when you broadcast, right? There's a lot of people with a lot of different contexts listening to your message. And if you're not conscious of this, if you kind of say, good, I'm trying to be authentic, I'm just going to think out loud. Well, you got to understand, there's a general part of the populace that will not have that context when they listen to you, and they're going to misinterpret you instantly, right? And so in terms of being a conscious and responsible leader, being responsible for the impact of your communication, unless you can hold this context really tight, and you're talking to only the people that can also hold that context, you are going to create systemic upheaval as soon as you do something knowing it's going to get uncontextualized. And so in some ways, it's just being smart about not, again, I mentioned Gregory Bateson earlier. He talked about how most people do not think in loops. They don't think that in terms of connections and interrelationships, that if I speak, you're going to respond, but in the way you respond changes what I speak, and vice versa. And we're in a loop, or we're in a relationship with each other. And leadership is very much relationship. It's based on relationship. It's not an arc, as Bateson would say. It's not I say something and that's it, right? And so it's not like, what's my leadership message? First, who's your audience? Right? What's the loop? How are they going to interpret this? What do they need to know? What someone asked the question, what do I don't say? Well, who's your audience, and what don't they need to know at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to jump in there quickly because I got an observation of my own, just my own experience. Again, I seem to be going back to my days working in politics in this discussion a lot, which I don't usually do. But I found with politicians communicate, and I'm sure this is true for other leaders, there's multiple audiences, right? So I remember working on a speech, and without going into the specifics of it, it was a speech to be given in front of a foreign policy audience, like diplomats and that sort of thing from other countries. And yet in the draft of the speech, I was strongly encouraged to put in a whole bunch of domestic political things. And I tried to push back against that and say, well, this audience isn't interested in that particular message, right? And in fact, they'll find it a bit abrasive that we're talking about this kind of stuff. But, you know, a more seasoned political operative told me, well, actually, this speech is going to be circulated to all the other people on the team of this lineup, and they're going to read the speech, and they need to know that we're thinking about this front and center. So that's, yeah, that's just something that came to mind right then. I want to go to SAWSAN now and have a chat to you about megatrends. And then we have a clip actually, which we'll line up now. It's ready to go, and then we'll move on to Q&A after we've had a bit of a chat. Last clip.
I spend a lot of time on the computer when I'm not doing other things. The dogs are enjoying laying on all my clothes because they have mommy scent. You can't believe it, but there is actually a great dining room table underneath here. I have one usable chair that I know of. There might be some more around the table. I really don't remember.
It's great fun, isn't it? Okay, so it's only a few weeks ago, really, that we were watching scenes on TV of people hoarding, you know, toilet paper and rice and other things like that, and you know, queuing up at Bunnings and purchasing all sorts of things there, and appliances and that sort of thing. So was that a mega trend, like people sort of hoarding certain things and going out and deciding they needed this and needed that?
No, I don't think we can classify that behaviour as a mega trend. I think it was an overreaction to a perception of shortage.
Mm-hmm.
And very sadly, if you've seen in the US, you know, many of the shortages are actually quite real. They weren't as temporary as we experienced here in Australia. And so that is likely more a concern. It's quite pleasing to know that now that behaviour is largely stopped. We've restocked. But yeah, just a short-term reaction.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed on that was I heard journalists talking about it before it was really a thing. Like, I think there might have been one supermarket that sold a lot of toilet paper. And as soon as they started talking about it and sharing photos of it on Twitter, I thought, now we're in trouble. Like, this is sort of going to happen and take off. And that, I guess that difference between perception and reality is interesting, right? So there only needs to be a perception of shortage or potential shortage.
Yes,
for people to
well,
go out there.
This comes back to Nick's comment right from the start when he said that sometimes politicians can inadvertently create complexity when a message just needs to be very simple. So the supermarket hoarding phenomenon started when, certainly in Victoria, when the Premier indicated that we would need to quarantine for 14 days and suggested we would need to have about 2 weeks worth of supplies at home.
Yeah.
So that, I think, was the catalyst for the behaviours that we subsequently saw.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it was, the messaging I remember was, we suggest that you have about 14 days of supplies, but don't go and hoard. And again, at the time, I remember thinking that won't happen. Like once you've literally opened the floodgates there. And I don't even say that with any, you know, blame or malice towards them. I think it's a difficult message to craft, right?
Yes.
And I guess going forward, hopefully we'll perfect that.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, did you want to come in, Nick?
Yeah, I was going to say, what are your do you think this might be a reaction as well? But what are your thoughts on whether, you know, in the future people will, that a good selling point for a new house will be having like some sort of not like a doomsday bunker or some sort of storage facility where people can stockpile things just in the event that something like this happens again. Extra freezer room, extra storage space, those sorts of things.
I think that's quite a plausible scenario, Nick. I think it's reasonably common in the US, but yes, whether or not we go to the US style attics or cellars, whereby we keep additional things, other than just, our wine collection or whatever it might be. Yeah, I can see that happening.
Mm.
One of the trends that possibly as well is for many years people were seeing psychologists about fear of getting contaminated or contaminating other people with germs and phobias and things like that. And that's actually, I think more recently, it's been legitimised that fear is actually quite real. And there's probably plenty of people out there who now think, well, I can't be convinced otherwise now. This is a definite thing that can happen.
I've wondered about that too, like what we consider to be germophobia. Maybe even our criteria for that might even change a little bit, like what we consider to be reasonable and unreasonable, hygiene. A lot of it's quite reasonable. I remember when I first started sort of, going out and traveling and stuff as a grown-up, I used to be thrilled by the idea of staying in a hotel. Even by my more recent times, I look at the remote control and like I've read, these reports about all the bacteria that's found on remote controls and stuff like that. Whereas, 20-year-old me wouldn't have thought about that at all. Sai, did you want to jump in there? I thought I saw your hand up.
Yeah. In terms of what we're seeing, again, this is a whole what if to when if, right? So the fear factor component, and the reason why I want to raise this is because my family used to live in Singapore, and when I visit them, they lived in an apartment block, and there is actually a room in the apartment that's actually a bunker. And the reason why is because a lot of the apartments were built with those bunkers as a standard feature, and you can't make calls out of the bunker, and it was just small enough for about a family of 4. And the reasoning behind it is because the threat of potential attack was quite high. And sorry, not to bring anything like that in here, but just the concept of what if to when in the minds of the developers was clear as day to say that's actually a standard feature we need to put in. It's not saying that it's ever it might not even ever happen, but the likelihood was high enough for them to put that as a standard feature. It's not an option, it's a standard. So that's the degree of our acceptance of the fear and the likelihood of it occurring has changed dramatically in this thing.
Yeah, I suppose there's also, conversation about where people want to live, what kind of environment. So the whole idea of living in the inner city, the charming little apartment, you're busy, you eat out 4 or 5 nights a week, or that sort of thing. You don't spend that much time at home anyway. You don't really care if you have a backyard, whether that kind of thing will change. SAWSAN, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I was also going to ask you, some of our preliminary discussions, you kind of identified some opportunities that you've identified going forward, including maybe some more positive opportunities coming out of the situation that we're dealing with at the moment?
Well, if we're no longer tied to the rat race and this whole notion of urbanisation, then why wouldn't we take the opportunity, for example, to try and live in a totally independent way? So that is, we find the spot where we want to be and live off the grid. Renewable energy, septic systems, for example, which have come such a long way since when they first created permaculture, growing your own vegetables. This is what I mean by the COVID introducing a counter trend and going back to a more of a subsistence style lifestyle.
Yeah, this is really interesting, I think. What do others think on that?
Yeah, can I just comment on, because I think that's really fascinating. And I think one of the consequences is that it also gives people a sense of control over their life, because they're sort of controlling all of their inputs. And when people have a sense of control over their own lives, they don't necessarily then need to rely on other systems. So for example, they become less likely to, and I'm not sure this is good or bad, but they become less likely to believe in God, because they don't need to sort of vicariously need some other divine spirit to give them a sense of control. They also become less likely to believe in extremist views, because they don't need these sort of views and ideologies to give them that sense of control. So there could be a whole lot of potentially positive or interesting complex consequences of this sense of control that diminished urbanisation could elicit.
I think just as an attending point to that, Simon, and that's such a great point, when the difference between having to work and choosing to work can be a fundamentally, can provide a whole different experience of work. If we were to take advantage of much cheaper lifestyles by not being in, suburbs, which are multi-million-dollar suburbs now, if we if we become financially independent and we choose to work, that is a completely different experience of work than having to, be a slave to the dollar, I think.
Yeah. Joe Chang has been waiting patiently for a while to ask a question. So Joe, if you're still with us, I'm going to bring you up now. Other panelists who may have thoughts on that discussion, they hold on to them and you'll have the opportunity to chime back in. Okay. Joe, I'm sending you an invitation to come up on screen. Should be with us in a moment. Joe, hi. Just need to unmute yourself, Joe, and introduce yourself and ask a question.
Hi there. Sorry.
That's okay. We can hear you. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I guess what I work for sort of like a government agency in New Zealand who's looking at sort of that working from home and how to encourage people to continue working from home. But there's also that thing around, I guess, the businesses and getting people into CBDs, getting back into CBDs. And I guess it's really about sort of the messaging or the transitioning of between the two that I'm kind of interested in. How do you kind of, I guess, what messaging should be kind of going out around that, and with the businesses potentially in the CBDs, they're crying out for some business for people to come back into the CBD to work. So yeah, so that was my question before. So yeah.
Yeah. SAWSAN, would you like to respond to that, or other people on the panel?
I'm happy to defer to my colleagues to respond. I think it was an excellent question.
Okay, it's there for the taking. Sometimes the questions are so good people don't know what to do with them.
I was just going to say, could you maybe just restate that question? I was just responding in the chat stream to another person. So
okay. Joe, are you still with us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess it's really about that sort of, so everybody is, there's sort of a push to keep people working from home. We have a lot, because of the social distancing on public transport and things like that, if a lot of the government workers can continue working from home, then we don't have the transport issues that we had before. And it's a trend that, for a lot of reasons, obvious reasons, people want to continue. But then the CBDs are kind of saying, hey, look, all the businesses, we want those people back into the CBD to be, buying coffees and buying lunches and all of those things. And I guess it's about that transitioning of, if we are, what should we be doing? Should we be monitoring and trying to figure out what people's intentions are, what businesses' intentions are, and then letting the businesses and the CBDs know that, and what should sort of like at a government level, what should the messaging be around those things? Because I can see that there's going to be pressure put on us from both angles in terms of environmental principles and all those kind of things, as well as the businesses getting back going. So.
Yeah, I think, I was reflecting on this the other day, like especially having been working at home now for a couple of months, is that if you were to do this 100% of the time, and everyone does it who can, of course, not including the blue collars, what does that actually mean? Like, what are we actually building and designing then? Like, where are the contributions actually going? Because I think it completely changes what the investments will be in the future, and all of a sudden we're now almost like before, the building in the city and building transportation to get to the city. What are going to be those projects? So it changes everything fundamentally. But the thing I was kind of curious about as well was how many people on the panel actually think that, rather than thinking that there is going to be a megatrend going that way, think that it'll actually recede quite rapidly and we'll go back into old habits again. Because, is it really changing? Is it a second order change, as Marvin suggested before, or will over time the system basically just naturally go back to the way it was because there was a reason it was that way in the first place?
From an experience design perspective, it is slightly unfortunate I'm able to say this, but I think it is going to recede back to the norm. There's even when you look at a lot of research that's been done about employee experience and consumer behavior post certain major events such as depression or pandemics or certain nature that impacted the globe, and the likelihood for people to go back to the way they used to has going back to the way it was before. However, there are a few things that this particular pandemic that we start to see that has an impact. One being that I think someone mentioned about productivity, Gemma even mentioned about productivity, that people suddenly became more productive in this particular environment than they were before. And when you look at the measurement of productivity, it's definitely, there is a different strong link back to bottom line of organizations. So if organizations themselves go, you know what, it's quite surprising, but a lot of our projects are on target, on budget, under time. So they would themselves try to enforce certain changes in the system in order to maintain the situation we're in now, to promote the working from home, purely because they see that it has a definite link back to productivity and their bottom line. So if you were to say about people wanting to go back to their normal life, I reckon people miss going to lunches, people miss having the social interaction, having the coffees, people miss the bonding component. But if I'm an employer, I'm not going to say that I don't miss the productivity increase. I'm not going to say that. Wow, that's massive change. I'm not going to say I miss the fact that when I'm in a meeting, it's a 15-minute meeting rather than half an hour, because people want to get off Zoom. So they just want to concentrate and then get out. I won't miss that part as an organization. So depending on who you ask, regression from the perspective of individuals, they probably do like to go for the physical stuff. But from organizations, they go, productivity has increased dramatically. I want to influence the system to keep that going.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think also that sort of there's the opportunity to potentially you have less building space as well as something that's being looked at the moment too, of sort of saying, okay, we don't need such a big building.
Yeah,
Yes,
I've seen that one in my own observation as well.
Yes.
As the timekeeper, I'm going to have to flag that we have 4 minutes to 11:30. We may actually sort of be cut off at that point. So I want to bring in one really quick question, if we have one more question left. Actually, we have an interesting one here in the Q&A box from Patrick McGrath. He said, I'd like to ask the panelists what leaders can do to manage motivation during this uncertainty. I think that's an interesting one. Anyone like to grapple with that? The motivation of people maybe on your team, people around you.
I could have a very quick answer, which is that I think one of the problems, the opportunities that we haven't made the most of, is that so much of the focus has been on the immediate term, where people are much more motivated, even during difficult times, of the long term. You know, a wonderful sort of vision, almost a perfect, idyllic situation in the future. And I don't think leaders have been able to integrate the complexities we're facing now with the possibilities of the future, which is exactly what our conversation is designed to do. So, I mean, really, in one way, to motivate employees is basically just to show them our conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're going to have to wrap up shortly. Nick, did you want to come in with any closing comments?
No, thanks, guys. I think the time went by really quickly, and yeah, thanks everybody for attending. We prepared this panel in part because it was also a bit of an experiment and something we wanted to do in response to the COVID-19, but also planning on potentially doing some more webinars. There might be some ones like this or some smaller ones as well. But yeah, all of those who came along and stayed for the whole journey, that was really great. And I really enjoyed the discussion. I have a feeling that I'd probably enjoy it more actually listening to it rather than participating, because I was envious of a couple of people there. David Banger was there in the feed saying that he was making some sauce while he was listening to everyone.
Great.
I think that's great. So like, if we can be source facilitators in some way, then that's an added bonus.
That's fantastic.
Thanks, everyone. There'll be a survey that I think that automatically gets sent through, so we can grab your feedback then. If there's any other questions, feel free to follow up with any of the panel. Myself, I can forward them on to the panelists. I'm sure they'd be happy to provide some responses. But yeah, once again, thank you again.
Yeah, I just echo that. the survey will be really valuable for us to sort of look at how we do these things going forward, make some changes, what you'd like to see done a little bit differently. Just speaking personally, I'd like to thank Nick for giving me the opportunity to moderate the session today, and all the panelists. I've learned so much, sort of, coming at it from a slightly different angle. It's been really valuable for me and a lot of fun. I've enjoyed interacting with the audience. I've seen some excellent chat going on there as well, sort of while talking on screen. I think that's fantastic. So we do these going forward. I think I'd like to see, keep that element of it and see more of that. And thanks everyone. Have an awesome weekend.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For those of you who've got the long weekend, have a nice long weekend. For those of you who don't, then, apologies.
Yes. Not everyone has it. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.